Hello and welcome back to VOX TERRA. So whether you are watching this video before or after the outcome of the presidential election, I'm just going to go through that last presidential debate and I'm going to criticize both candidates, but I'll make it clear that if you're watching it before the election and you haven't voted, I cast my vote for Biden if for no other reason than for the environment. Trump has been such a disaster, he got an F from the League of Conservation Voters before the end of his first year. But before I start with the environment, let's go through the flow of the debate and how the host opened up with a few questions that I would call otherizing and China bashing. So she asked, Donald Trump, you said you'll make China pay. And then after Trump went through his spiel, she then went to Joe Biden. How will you make China pay? Now, I believe that questions like that and that kind of focus distracts the public from change at home. But let me give you an example. Here's an underreported headline from Reuters news service from March 25 of 2020. Exclusive, U.S. slashed CDC staff inside China prior to coronavirus outbreak. So you see, while she's focused on that, people aren't seeing how the Trump administration or anybody who's anyone really for that matter within the Republicans generally who want to just get rid of those programs that are there to protect public health. Again, North Korea, who's going to be tougher? Who's going to be tougher on North Korea? And then we saw Biden taking on also a more militaristic stance towards North Korea. The host taking for granted that they need to be dealt with. Now, the problem with this approach, again, similar to China bashing, you're focusing public anger towards the outside, which I think distracts from change at home. Also, that heavy focus towards the outside contradicts the Bible if you're interested in the Bible, because the Bible says, look at the mote in thine own eye before you go criticizing the speck in your neighbor's. But further, it comes down to the way she posed these questions comes down to how free is this press really? Now, I was taught growing up in the 80s, it's a free press here, unlike those communists over there, where it's all state-owned. But what my teachers and the media itself never really highlighted is this free press is owned by large corporations and very wealthy individuals, some of which have ties to what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Now, I read an author maybe in 1991 or 92, I believe his name was Michael Parenti, who pointed out that, yes, we're taught we have this free press, and yes, there is a debate, but the debate will be something like, should we bomb this country or should we boycott this country? But there's never, is this country really our enemy? Does this country really need to be our enemy? And what business interests or what things were happening that created this enemy in the first place? But we can agree to disagree on that. I want us focused on the long-term survival of the species. But again, before I get to that, let me just move on to another thing brought up during the debate, or another issue, was what about these kids who now can't find their parents because they were separated at the border and the government just conveniently lost track of everything? Donald Trump made the comeback, Obama built the cages. But before I get to that issue, let me also cite from the Bible again, which says we are to welcome the stranger. And I say that to both my liberal friends who maybe are opposed to conservative traditional Christians and to conservative traditional Christians who may not be aware of that quote. In reality, if you looked at during the early days of the Trump administration, a lot of evangelical and other religious organizations were upset and are upset with Trump's immigration policies. So Trump's comeback was, well, Obama built the cages. Now, I don't know about that, but I do know that when I was on Facebook and that kind of thing, that friends who like Trump, right from the get-go, any criticism would say, well, what about Obama? What about Obama? That's a straw man argument. Well, what do I mean by straw man? Straw man means you created a fictitious version of your opponent, and then you're easily knocking it down. I say it's fictitious because a lot of the people criticizing Trump's immigration also criticized Obama. In fact, there was organizations that were concerned about immigrants' rights calling Obama the deporter-in-chief. So there never was this free pass for Obama, at least among activists, depending on what you're active on. So as long as we're on the topic of where people also criticized Obama, let me get on to fracking. Donald Trump tried to bring up, well, Joe Biden's going to outlaw fracking, and that's supposed to be a bad thing. Well, Joe Biden countered, I'm not going to outlaw fracking. Joe Biden then gave a defense of natural gas industry, saying it's a bridge fuel, and we can do carbon capture to sequester the greenhouse gases it makes. Well, from what I've seen in environmental literature for years now, is that we don't agree with this concept of bridge fuels. What you're talking about is then supporting a whole new industry that's a fossil fuel industry that will get its own political muscle, and it will then influence politics and society to defend its interest. Natural gas is a major greenhouse gas contributor. Now, I do believe, hypothetically, possibly if all the leaks were contained and it was really tightly regulated, it could be less of one, but that's not the case. And that would be very expensive to do. So we could subsidize natural gas to try to make it cleaner, or we could just subsidize energy efficiency and renewable energy. So I believe that Biden's defense of natural gas and fracking, in addition with fracking, environmentalists oppose it because it contaminates the groundwater with toxic fracking chemicals. So I believe that Biden's defense of fracking more so comes from he doesn't want to alienate the fracking industry within Pennsylvania and have them fund anti-Biden campaigns. And I believe that many of what leftists would call corporate Democrats, and remember though, the Republican Party is completely or very much bought up by fossil fuel industry interests right now. The Koch brothers, etc., Mercer family. But, although Mercer is not exactly fossil fuel, but the Kochs are, I've seen a history of criticism of the Clintons and then the Obama administration with their support of natural gas. So I'm assuming there are ties there. Now the Democrats at those higher levels, corporate levels, the non-Bernie Democrats have done a good job of severing their ties with oil and gas, but I don't know the same is true of natural gas. Now the host also asked Trump she said a question something like, how are communities of color who are living near these industrial petrochemical facilities, oil refining facilities, supposed to trust you when you've deregulated those industries, exposing them to more harm? So Trump countered with, hey, I'm making a lot of jobs for those communities. Well, first of all, this isn't what Biden said, this is what I'm saying. A lot of those people living at those fence lines to those industrial sites are not employed by them. Second, if you're employing people in the pursuit of poisoning themselves with carcinogens and other toxic chemicals, endocrine disruptors, etc., is that a good livelihood? And here we get into the nature of regulation versus non-regulation, and it's not all a win-lose situation with regulation. To a degree, you could view it as you're favoring a more responsible business actor over an irresponsible business actor by regulating. They started to get on the topic of Biden's climate plan and Biden's plans to energize our economy by transitioning towards a greener economy. Well, Trump began to attack wind power. He cited turbines kill the birds. He said the fumes involved in the creation of wind turbines are worse than the fumes from fracking. Something like that. And then he said about intermittent power. Now, regarding birds, what he left out, the host didn't pick up on, and I don't think Joe Biden picked up on, is that if you're subscribing to environmental organizations like the Audubon Society is the premier bird protection, for lack of a better way of putting it right now, environmental organization. The Audubon Society, I believe it was a March article, let me see. The Audubon Society in a June article said While America is in turmoil, the Trump administration is continuing its relentless war on nature. This administration is churning out policies that make it easier to kill birds, pollute our air and water, and endanger our health, but specifically kill birds. That article was referring to Trump's weakening or attempts to weaken something called the Migratory Bird Act Treaty, which put in place laws requiring responsible business practices regarding open pits of oil, oil spills and oil slicks, and other ways that birds are killed by the fossil fuel industry. So while we're on the topic of birds being killed by fossil fuels, an underreported story compared to the overreported story of birds being killed by wind turbines, the Audubon Society, the premier protector of birds, said they support responsible wind energy, where it is done in such a way that the bird migrations are being taken into account and they're using best practices to minimize bird deaths. The Audubon Society believes that the threats to bird populations from the climate change of this heating planet are far greater. In addition, so are the threats to birds from other matters like people's cats, collisions with cars, and the use of fossil fuels. Next, to the issue of intermittency that Trump brought up, I cited an earlier article whereby the Trump administration, believed in the efforts to defend the fossil fuel industry, shut down a study that was being done to show how we can connect the power grid in such a way so we can switch power around easier to ship where the winds are blowing or the sun's shining and connect the grid. Additionally, there's a lot of research being done on energy storage. So Trump both opposes wind energy and opposes solutions to the intermittency problem. A clear defender of fossil fuels. Trump then conflated or mixed together the Green New Deal, the Biden climate plan, and then some what I think are just fictions and misstatements to make the Biden climate plan sound extremely expensive. Well, first of all, his plan spends a lot less than Bernie's Green New Deal. Second of all, in my opinion, this economy is entirely subsidized. So really, we're just talking about switching subsidies around from polluting ourselves to death to less polluting activities. And third, Joe Biden pointed out that actually transitioning towards a cleaner economy and doing things like he's suggesting setting up vehicle recharging stations and for electric vehicles, the transition towards wind and solar will actually create more jobs and more wealth for average people than continuing to double down on investments in what are called high carbon infrastructure, like airlines or carbon destructive industries like airlines and oil pipelines. To wit, I cited an article earlier for you from an Oxford study showing that's completely true. Now we'll wrap this up with Trump then pushing Biden to say, are you going to get rid of fossil fuels? Well, here Biden hesitated for a moment, but then in my opinion, bravely, and I think he deserves some credit for this, bravely said, based on what's happening to our planet, we have to. Trump went on the attack with that, and I've seen Fox News go on the attack with that, which is why I think he deserves support for that. Biden, that is. One of Trump's attacks was, well, you're going to make China do it? So I have heard China use as an excuse not to protect our environment going back to 1990. Back in 1990, China was just coming online as a major capitalist economy. Their pollution output at that point was very minimal, far behind ours and the US of A. Now, they've slightly surpassed us in some ways, but not on a per-person basis. Only a certain percentage of their population is currently living this highly disposable, highly consumeristic lifestyle, where we burn through volumes of disposable plastic and pesticides and lawn pesticides on a daily basis. Trump talked about the need to just open the economy and act like everything's normal. Now, he didn't put it that way, but that, in my opinion, is basically what he's saying. We can't just shut this economy down. Well, again, to me, that's no vision. We need to envision not more jobs of poisoning ourselves to death with greenhouse gases and carcinogens, but that transition towards a less polluting economy. As I cited from the Bible earlier, I'll do it again. A 24/7 consumeristic economy where it never stops, it has no breaks, we're constantly buying, selling, and racing around, is not biblically sound. And in an earlier video, I cited from Leviticus to show not just does the Bible call people to take a rest one day a week and scale back to necessary activities only, in a sense, but it also calls in Leviticus for a once every 7-year rest for a whole year, especially for the land. Well, that's not compatible with 24/7, nonstop, open up the economy, pretend everything's normal, and keep going forward with business as usual until the next pandemic comes along and the climate disasters increase. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please share, please comment. Please click that notification bell so you know when I'm putting up a new video, which brings me back to please subscribe. And until next time, oh yes, and consider being a patron of Patreon and supporting this channel. It's a very time-consuming endeavor. And until next time, peace be with you.